So what we're going to do now is to have a bit of a panel discussion, a panel conversation. I've got a few questions to start us off. And for a little under an hour, we'll chat. But towards the end of that, we'll invite questions as well. So if you have questions for the panel or for particular people on the panel, then feel free to put them in the Zoom chat as well, and we'll kind of invite those a bit later. But let me introduce Richard Openg-Boateng, who is the Young Evangelism Officer for the Methodist Church, based here at Cliff, and Dawid Irfan, who is a former youth president for the Methodist Church, now based in Cardiff and working for a church project. And I'll let you both say a little bit more about yourselves. And really my first question, and maybe Richard, we'll start with you, is just if you could tell me or tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your family background.
Yeah, it's really amazing to be here, first and foremost. And Claire, I was so inspired and blessed by your presentation, so thank you so much for that. A little bit about myself, my name is Richard. I work here at Cliff College as a Young Evangelist Officer, and that's in partnership with the Methodist Church. A bit about my journey here was I was brought up, I think like the day after I was born, I was in church. Like it's just been part of my family's, like my memory. It's always been in my memory, and it's always had a massive way of shaping who I am, my faith, and the way I view life. So my mum emigrated over from Ghana to the UK. And I have an older brother and a sister. So I was raised in a single parent household. So why that's particularly important was because I saw my mum regularly praying. And she wasn't praying because that was the thing to do. She was praying because like our lives depended on it. She was raising 3 kids by herself in the UK. So I've seen my mum live out faith, and that was really, really impactful for me. Kind of moving forward from that, as I said, we were always in church. Church was just a part of a thing we did. If Monday we went to school, Sunday we went to church. There was never ever a question or debate about that. But what I'm particularly grateful to my mum about, not just the way that she lived out her faith, that she would pray for us, take us to all-night prayers and all of that stuff there, of that generation and from that background. What I did love about my mum was that on a Sunday, we would go to church twice. So from 11 o'clock to 12:30, we would go to Celeste Evangelical Church, which was a predominantly white middle-class church. We would go there. And then from 2 o'clock till 6:30, we would go to our traditional Ghanaian church. So I was brought up seeing a difference and a diversity in the way that people lived out their worship of Christ. So for me, that's been incredibly beneficial because whether my mum knew it or not, I feel quite comfortable in different places of worship. So if it's loud, I'm comfortable in that, and expressive, I'm comfortable in that. If it's quiet and reflective, I'm comfortable in that, because that's the background that I'm coming from. That's been incredibly beneficial. Maybe I'll go into that a little bit later. But I think it has also there are some questions that's come along with that. And noticing some differences in that, that maybe we'll discuss a little bit later in this panel, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Thanks so much. Dawid, do you want to talk a bit about your own background?
It's not a competition, but if I if I think about myself,
you were born in the church, right?
Yeah. So I don't remember my first time being the day after I was born, but my kind of background, my life story is that I was born in September and my parents got ordained in April. So like my whole entire life I've been in the church. I've got 2 older sisters. They both, after they finished their studies, they wanted to go just learn more about God and go deeper into their theology. So they both went to Bible college. They're married to pastors as well. My younger sister, she's a Methodist youth rep. My parents are pastors. And for myself, last year I served as the Methodist youth president. And the way that worked out was, I say that it's a huge testimony in my life. So my whole entire life, I've grown up in and around the church, been involved in that in all different ways. But COVID, it was a bit of a strange time for me. So I was in my second year in university, looking to do a year in industry. I had a few final interviews lined up. I got a call in March of 2020, and I thought, I've secured a role. But the call basically said, sorry, we're actually having to let people go. So we're not taking students on anymore. I went home and ended up doing my third year from home after that. But in between that time when lockdown happened, what we did at home, every single day for about 6 months, every single weekday, we had worship. So at first we started on, so my dad being the minister, what we did was we'd have time slots for an hour each with 2 families. Monday to Friday we'd pray with a family at 5, then pray with a family at 6. We did that for about a month. And then the whole entire church, or even people friends and families from around the world, so it was like Canada, Africa, the UAE, people from all over the world said they want to worship too. And so we turned that into a Zoom worship. And having to be there to actually lead the tech or start the Zoom, do work on the sound, doing all that, there was no escape for me. I had to be in that room, listen to 2 different sermons every single day for about 6 months. And that really did turn my life around personally, because it was the same stuff that I'd been hearing from people in my church, from my dad or from my mum. But at that time, it really did hit me and it got to me. And at the same time, I saw a job advert that came up for the Methodist Youth President. My dad asked me if I want to go for it. I wasn't really into it. He knows this as well. We talk about it all the time. But I wasn't really into it, and I just said, all right, if you want me to, I'll apply for it. I'll go for it. So, they liked me. They asked me to come for an interview. I had an interview. Then it came to voting, which happened at 3 January. And the day before Christmas Eve in 2020, I got a call saying that from September I'll be the new youth president. And the way that I reflect on it is that it's a huge testimony in my life where God basically gave that blessing to me, in the sense where when I came home in lockdown, I didn't waste my life. I didn't throw it away. I didn't do other things. I spent that time growing deeper in my faith and in my connection with God and my family, and that was a small return God gave to me. And that job was right after uni. As soon as I graduated in July. I started the job in August. And the way I look at it is that when God blessed me with that job, I think he also kind of chose me in that sense. So from that young, early age, I've had a lot of people pray for me and prophesy for me, but it's something I always kind of ran away from. Even right now, the current job I'm in, I'm there till August, and after that, it's my belief, or it's my passion. I kind of want to go into the secular world. But even last night, someone sent me a job advert, and it looks really interesting. So the more I try to kind of go in the opposite direction, like Jonah, I think God just pulls me back into where he wants me.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. We'll watch the space to see what's next for you as well, which is exciting. Thank you. Claire, you've hinted a little bit about some of your background, but do you want to say anything more about your family background and
just
context?
So child of Caribbean parents, Windrush generation and Windrush grandparents. So notably, just in case if anyone doesn't know, my grandparents came to this country. They were Christians, wanted to worship, and this is the testimony of a lot of Caribbean Christians who came to this country during the 50s and 60s and wanted to go to the established church, did attend, and they were told, thank you for coming, please don't come back, or there's a church for your kind up the road. And this is just one part of why the black majority church exists in these countries, because of that. So from that, my grandparents started a church, and that's how a lot of black majority church began, because of that initial rejection, and that's why we have this divide still today. So grew up in church, and I didn't know, because I didn't know that white people were Christians. To be honest, I was always around black Christians, so I didn't have your experience of going to two types of churches. And then along the lines, because we rented a hall to worship with our Methodist brothers and sisters, we worshipped in the hall. They lent us the hall and they worshipped in the church. And then one of the pastors of the Methodist church said, let's worship together. So we used to have a Sunday service like once a month, worshipping together, and that was really beautiful. So yeah, always grew up initially in black Pentecostalism, but have since obviously going to uni, and I appreciate services that use liturgy. I appreciate, expressive worship, whatever. So, but I really, that's a bit of my background, really. Yeah, preacher's kid, so always in church.
Great, thank you. And my next question, just thinking, I guess, about culture and thinking about being, I guess, a ethnic minority within a predominantly white British culture. What was that experience like growing up? Were there times or circumstances where you were aware of being an ethnic minority, or any reflections on that question? Dawid, shall we start with?
Yeah, I think, I'd actually like to take that first. So I forgot to mention earlier, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but you're probably looking at me thinking, well, where's this guy from, his color, and, everything about me. So I was actually born in Pakistan, and my answer to that question starts right there at birth. So the reason that me and my family, we moved here as a family when I'm 23 right now, we moved here when I was 6, was due to religious persecution. And one thing that's always been in the mind of me and my parents has been, what is our actual place, what is our actual home? Because when we were in Pakistan, so when we had to move here, religious persecution, we were victims of persecution, but in an indirect sense. So being a minister, being a pastor, my dad, he had kind of a military background as well, so he used to help those who were persecuted, and then in retaliation that came back onto us. And when it got to a point where it was really dangerous for us, the church kind of basically pushed us to leave the country. But the question that's always kind of been in my mind literally since I was 6 years old was, in a place like that, growing up in a place like Pakistan, where everyone is pretty much a Muslim, it's the only country in the world that was specifically formed to be a Muslim country, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And I was having a conversation with someone in a shop owner. I was getting a takeaway 2 weeks ago. He asked me, oh, where are you from? I said, Pakistan. He just asked me, he said, what mosque do you go to? And I said, oh, I'm a Christian. He said, no, you're not a Christian. At the time, 2 weeks ago, my beard was a bit longer as well. He said, well, you look like you're a regular mosque goer. I said, no, I'm not. And I don't know why it still eludes me right now. At the time, I kind of froze. I didn't know what to say, but he said, well, next time, don't tell people you're from Pakistan. Tell them you're Indian. But the thing people don't understand, or they don't realize, or sometimes they choose to be blind to it, is that a country that has 200, 300 million people in it, even though it's predominantly Muslim, it does have 3% of the population is Christian, which is a huge amount. That's still a couple million people. So when we were living there, when we were there, people used to tackle us or think of us as being kind of westernized. So we're still from there, but we're westernized. We're not a part of the social culture or the religion. So we're seen as being lower or poorer or not enough, not worthy. Then when we came here, when we came to the Home Office to claim asylum, they obviously, saw us just as being normal Pakistani people. And one of the biggest things that I thought when I came here was, I was 7, 8 years old when I went through this experience. Ed, my family and my dad's work pretty well. So when we first came here, my parents, they thought, okay, we're in a Christian country. Even here, we want to carry on working with God, working for God, working in ministry. And what they did was, as a family, we went to the Central Library in Cardiff and we asked for English Bible. They said that in the whole of Cardiff, in all the 14, 15 libraries there's no Bibles. There's only one Bible, and that's in the Central Library. And that was, again, something that troubled us a little bit, saying, because we thought we came to a Christian country, but our experience was totally different. When we came here, we saw that life was not what we imagined. So over there, we were tackled as being a minority. Here, we thought we were coming to a certain place, but our experiences were totally different. So in that sense, it just always felt out of place. And in the past year, especially when I was serving as youth president, a lot of my friends, a lot of my school friends, that's still my friendship circle, they're still my best friends. None of them are Christians, but they're interested in what I do, they're interested in my work, we'll talk about it. But even in that sense, it's a little out of place because they all went to a Christian school, just like me, but none of them are actually church-going Christians. So, because we went to school assemblies, we went to Eucharist, everyone knows the Lord's Prayer, they'll know Kumbaya Our Lord, they'll know all those songs, Shine Jesus Shine, but you still feel that sense of where do I fully belong in terms of community. I think that's probably the best way I could try and answer that about my personal self.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And that's so complex, isn't it? The kind of identities and being minorities in different kinds of ways in different countries. And yeah, thank you for that. Richard, could you share a bit about your experience?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, growing up, I didn't grow up feeling like we were the minority, or I was part of a minority group. That's probably because the area that I was brought up in, within London, was so diverse. And in honesty, probably on my road, on my high street, so many people were from Black ethnic minority groups. Even the school that I went to, even on the staffing system, to be honest, it was quite diverse. There was a diversity there. The deputy head was Black from Nigeria. My English teacher was Black. So I did see representation in my local area. I know that's not necessarily everybody's experience, but that was mine. I think where I did start to see that there was a difference, definitely was amongst my dealings with the police. There was definitely, I never came across a lot of representation of people from ethnic minorities on the police force. And my dealings when I have dealt with the police wasn't, that was where I saw there was a difference there with regards to that. And actually, I think it became really stark to me when I came to university. Prior to that, I'd never really left my area in London. All I knew was my little area in London with my friends. Everything was there that I needed. We never really left or went on holiday. That just wasn't my experience growing up. When I moved up to university, when I moved up to Manchester to come to university, that was when I was like, wow, I am in the minority. I'm in the minority here. And that was quite a shock to me, a shock to the system.
Thanks so much, Richard. Thanks. Claire, do you want to share anything about your...
I won't add any more. I think I've mentioned before. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Just the third question, and maybe Claire will come to you first, is around, just to pick up on one of your points earlier, actually, about God not being colorblind and kind of celebrating diversity, and just thinking about how your ethnic identity has shaped your faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things for me was similar to Richard in that, as I said, when I was a child, when I came into contact with Christians who were white, I was like, whoa, oh. Literally, because I was growing up in church, born in church, everything church among the Black Christian community in the UK. But I think what's been really powerful in my experience has been that seeing, so my dad was not university trained, never went to university, came to this country when he was like 15. He's now passed away. Was a motor mechanic, but was a pastor in a church. And seeing people in church, Black people in church who had leadership positions. This is why I've raised that thing about multi-ethnic churches. We like the idea of it, but what does that actually look like? And are we comfortable with seeing a representation of all ethnic backgrounds across what churches look like? But the beautiful thing was seeing, I don't know, my auntie who cleaned, for instance, for her day job, being evangelist so-and-so in the church, and seeing that, God can use people, and they were formative in my faith as a young person, massively helped me in my spiritual disciplines and discipleship now. Just seeing that was really powerful for me. Seeing, friends and family, church family, encountering racism in the workplace, praying to God for their stay in this country, these being really live topics, and actually seeing God work and seeing God answer their prayers. I encountered God through him answering the prayers of my people. And, on the road, kind of doing apologetics and hearing people's objections to faith. One of them is, what about the God of the Bible, the Old Testament, and is he like this? Is he genocidal? Is he et cetera, et cetera? But growing up, I remember listening, and it's really interesting because Richard Dawkins says that children have no problem with the Old Testament God of the Bible. Hearing my dad sort of preach and read scripture with us about God taking up for the oppressed, God being on the side of the underdog in those passages, the Lord of hosts, the heaven's armies, hearing those passages and having no problem with them, none of the kind of problems that people have with those texts now. And so just being part of a faith community where God was on our side. And I'm not saying that God takes sides in that sense, but seeing that in the lives of my Christian friends and leaders and church family, but also in the way that scripture was read, not having a problem at the time. I definitely understand why people have objections to it now. God, moving on behalf of the underdog. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Richard, you talked a bit about being a part of two churches growing up and kind of having the experience of both. And I wonder about your response to that question about ethnic identity and faith and that shaping your faith. Would you have a take on that?
Yeah, it's been massive for me, like so massive. And if I'm honest, it just makes me makes me look at God in awe. I love the vibrancy of what I've experienced, going to my traditional Ghanaian church on a Sunday, and the fervency. I relate so much to what you're saying, Claire, about seeing my aunties, my uncles, the past praying prayers fervently. God, if you don't move in this situation, there's no hope. Like, I've sat there, I've seen that. I've seen when they've rejoiced when God's come through. And that's built faith in me that, you know what, prayer works. It makes a difference because I've seen it in that context. I personally have experienced that. I call it like radical welcome, that hospitality welcome. When I went to that evangelical church that was white middle class up the road, and the way that we were embraced, the way that we wasn't, I didn't feel patronized or othered or anything like that. I felt, no, you're just as much as welcomed into this community as anyone else. A quick story on that is that I remember going to the service, and me and my brother, for whatever reason, we would sit in the vestibule. So they had the vestibule, and then you had the main church hall that you could then go into and sit. And for whatever reason, sometimes we would arrive a little bit late, so we'll just sit in the vestibule and stay there. And we would do that for weeks on end. And I remember one time my brother was like, for whatever reason, he didn't go to the church service, so I went. So I was there by myself. I got there a little bit late. I sat in the vestibule, and the pastor of the church was preaching. They went into their first song, and I remember he got up from the stage, he left, he walked past everybody, he went into the vestibule, he grabbed me by the hand, and he took me into the main part of the church, and he sat me down, and he said, everybody's welcome here, son. Everyone's welcome here, son. So for me, like, that's been my experience, that's, when I think of the gospel, I'm like, this is beautiful, man. Like, everybody's welcomed or should be welcomed. And that's been my experience. But I completely acknowledge that there's always been the question in my mind that I go to this church, which is predominantly white, and then in the afternoons I go to another church, which is predominantly black. The central point of both is that we're both lifting up and exalting Jesus. Why aren't we doing this together? Like, why is it separate? And I think Claire raised a really good point and acknowledging that actually some of this, we do have to look back in history and see that actually we had people that did come to this country and they weren't welcomed. And that's led to having to start different churches where it has split off. So my thing is that moving forward, how do we have something that is radical welcome for both, that doesn't repeat those mistakes? But in answer to your question, like, there's this awe that I have for the Lord because I see the beauty and the diversity and the radical welcome that I received, and also the radical fervency in prayer that I saw in the afternoons in my church and how God came through. And that's birthed the faith in me to say, I believe that God can come through. It shaped me massively.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Thanks. Dawood, any thoughts from you about your ethnic identity and faith, whether you've been shaped by that or?
My ethnic identity is still forming my faith, and I think it'll continue to do that for as long as I live, really, because when we talk about people of all tribes, all nations, all tongues, and we see them together in unity in that revelation, that's not something that's for the future, it's something that's for now as well. And if I talk about it personally, so coming from a South Asian Christian household, when we came here in Cardiff in Wales, like, we were like one of the first Christian families as well. And what we started doing at the time was, this was around 2006, we basically used to meet, it was our family and about 4 or 5 other people, like, it was about 15 of us in total. We'd meet in different houses and just worship in our language. And the purpose for that was literally just for a taste of our language. It's not because we didn't want to go to other churches because we didn't like other people or something. We went to our churches, we went to our local churches, but we just did that after as well. And in 2008, my parents started a Urdu, Hindi and Punjabi church in Cardiff, and then 2015 in Swansea too. But the whole purpose for that was, it wasn't because they wanted to have their own church or they wanted to have people, they wanted to have a community, because even from that, that's not a part of their role. That's something we do ourselves. That's something they literally started for their children, to stay in connection with the faith, the background, and the religion. And when I think about it, there's a lot of different ways in how people think and how their ideas about faith are based. So when we saw that the apostles went throughout the world, it was Thomas who went into that region of India and Pakistan. So it's an ongoing joke, but we say that we have the same trust and belief as him, that we were, as Indians and Pakistanis, we wouldn't believe in something or we wouldn't trust it until we see the holes ourselves, until we see it ourselves. But the way we worship is, again, it's really vibrant. So I think that brings a lot of uniqueness to it. So the churches that I've grown up in are very different to churches that I sometimes now attend. But either way, I'm happy with both. I enjoy in both. I feel that connection with God in both. But I still feel a bit more comfortable in what I've grown up and around in. So we have in South Asian culture, we have a lot of emphasis on psalms. So when we have worship, we tend to sing psalms a lot, which is very similar to the way that Jews worship as well. So it's the different aspects of worship that come together as well to form who I am and what my identity is in my faith.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks for that. My last question before we open it up to those who want to kind of ask the panel anything is a general one, Ree, which is what do you think that the church needs to know when reaching out a ministry or mission to children, youth, or families from minority ethnic backgrounds? So feel free to chip in, in any order. What are your thoughts on that when you look at the UK church and think, okay, these are things you need to kind of bear in mind and keep in account? I know, Claire, you've touched on some things, but any thoughts on that?
I think that radical welcome for me is there's something in that. How are we welcoming people from different backgrounds, ethnicities? Like, how is our welcome? I look back at my experience with real positivity, and real joy, because of that welcome that I was given. But I know that that's not the story for everybody. And if you go back a couple of generations, that definitely wasn't the story for some of those people that came over from the Windrush generation and stuff. So for me, I guess there is a practical question, of what does our welcome look like to those that are of the minority in this setting, that are coming through those doors? Like, how do we make them feel and know that actually they are just as loved, just as valued by God as anybody else that's here? Because that was my experience. I think something that I'm more kind of processing and thinking out loud that I was just for, that's brilliant, was when you were sharing in your presentation about looking at some of the lives of people that were in slavery and how their faith played a role with them in slavery. I think that's massive. I think that's so massive. I know a little bit of people like Harriet Tubman and stuff like that, but actually I know that there was people within the slave trade on different plantations where they still met in churches, they still were living out their faith. How did they live through that? Like, how was that experience? How did they reconcile that? I think there's some real beauty in being able to kind of look and learn from that, just as much as we would look and learn from a Calvin, a Luther, or whoever else. I think there's something in that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Thanks.
Can you just repeat the question, please?
Yeah, it's what do you think the church needs to know about ministry and mission to children, youth, and family from minority ethnic backgrounds?
I had a lot of stuff going in my mind, so that's why I said if you just say the question again, I'll go back to the basic. Well, I literally just wrote something down, and what I wrote down was tokenism versus ability, where something that I've noticed, especially being involved in the church or in leadership roles myself, for a lot of different things, for the church, now that they want to involve people of ethnic minorities or culturally diverse congregations, it comes out of guilt because it hasn't previously been done, which I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but the method in the way that it's done as well, I think that needs to be kind of evaluated again, because something that I've noticed, it's a very deep thing. So if anyone has a question, I'll be happy to discuss this after. But something that I've noticed is, for example, if there's a group for something that is going to need 10 young children, they would literally split it down the middle and say, okay, we're going to have they'll have 7 white people, for example, and then 3 children from diverse backgrounds, which sometimes it comes across that it comes off as tokenism to those children, or that's how they might feel, that, oh, we're not able enough, or they don't think we're that good. They've only just put us into this to fill up that quota, which that can be really hurtful for young children sometimes. And I'm saying this having actually experienced and been a part of that. But apart from that, I'd say generally the best thing to do is make the children feel welcome. So that response I just gave right now was my experience in the past 2 or 3 years. But my experience in the 20 years before that was totally different. Because even when I moved to Cardiff, the church that we went to, our family, we were the first ever non-white, we were the first like non-white people in that church. And I never felt out of place, or I never felt judged. I never felt any particular way, because sometimes I think about it, people ask, did you face some sort of racism? Did you face this? Did you face any difficulties? Like, I'm basically just in the middle. I didn't feel any type of way, because the love that I felt, or the welcome that we felt from church friends, or from school friends, or from teachers, or from anyone who we interacted with, or who I interacted with, it just felt normal. It felt as if I was a part of that society, I was a part of that culture. I never felt like an outsider. I never felt any certain way. And now that I'm seeing the world a bit more, I see that that's not the experience for everyone. So I'm really grateful that I had that experience. But I know it's really difficult for some people, and it's really different for them. I lived for a short while in Wesley's Chapel in London, in Shoreditch. I lived there. And when I moved in, it was just after the pandemic. So I was having a conversation on the phone with the minister, Reverend Jennifer Smith at the time. And I just asked her about what the church is like, because since I'm living there, we just kind of assume that I'll attend church there. And she told me, she said, well, before COVID, the membership or the weekly attendance on a Sunday was around 400, and 80% of the 400 people were either from a Ghanaian or Nigerian, South African background, and it was really diverse. And one thing that I'd say is to actually keep children involved in that, or keep them in the faith, not hurt them, show them the love of God, is to keep involving the young children in worship in that sense, which I saw there. And last Sunday, I was at a church in Birmingham. It was my first time I'd went to that church. But the district chair is a black woman. The superintendent of that circuit is a black man. And the minister of that church is a Chinese minister. She's a Chinese lady. But it was beautiful to see how it all worked out, because I'd never been there, and I knew they have a huge Zimbabwean fellowship. I didn't know what to expect. But the way they did it was on the side of the room where they had the hymn numbers up. There was only 3 hymn numbers up there. And I thought, well, how are they going to do it like an hour and a half long service with just 3 hymns? What I found out was it was actually 7 hymns, but they alternated. It was English, then the Shona language, then English, and then another language. And then when the young children from the Sunday school came up to present what they did, I kid you not, there were 7 young children, and they were all from a Chinese background. And it was really beautiful to see how that worked out as well, because the church enabled that position. The church actually provided that, because all 7 of those children came from a Chinese background. And so the Sunday school teacher also was from that background. The people who were singing in Shona language, the Zimbabwean fellowship, they were given that time or that space, not as tokenism, but it seemed like they were more a part or more involved in the worship. And I think that's a great way to make young children really feel involved and that they're welcome, so they can hear the language that they hear at home the instant that they leave their house. It doesn't change. They don't need to be someone else. Even when they're in church, they can still be the same exact person that they are with their parents. They can be like that with people in church too, so they're not outsiders and they're not alone.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for that. Claire, I know you raised some issues during your presentation, obviously, but any
Yeah,
thoughts?
I'll just sum up in short. I would say that really I would encourage all of us to really digest the truth that justice, diversity, inclusion, all of these buzzwords we hear in culture belong to God first. Okay, it's the conversation for the church. The church should be leading this conversation. We shouldn't have to depend upon sort of cultural critique from outside to do that. It emanates from who God is. Once we know that, we won't be afraid and we will genuinely want to engage in using resources that show God's hand at work everywhere. And avoid tokenism and avoid, doing things just for, we need to tick this diversity box. Actually, we will appreciate God's hand is at work everywhere because it comes from him. It doesn't come from the culture of the world, it comes from him. And just one resource I wanted to say, I did mention the Jude 3 project before, just in terms of their apologetics work anyway, but they've just released a resource. And I think this is kind of getting at your point about tokenism, where I think it's called How to Talk to Gen Z About Sexuality. And so Lisa Fields, African-American woman, another Bible teacher, I've forgotten her name, she's an African-American woman, has joined up with another ministry with these two, I think they're two white guys, and together they're doing videos and presentations and resource booklet on human sexuality. So my point is, regardless of where they land on the debate, is not what we're talking about here, is that they're addressing something within the Christian faith for young people, and it's not just representation for representation's sake. It's clearly the Jude 3 Project has the ability to remove barriers to faith and explain things, and this group of people, this other organization, do that same work. So actually reaching out to partners in the gospel, seeing ethnic minority churches as partners in the gospel, not as juniors. Remember that condescension to, Reformed theologies here and everything else is there. How can we actually work together? And it will take effort. It's going to be uncomfortable to do that. But I think when we understand and properly agree with yes and amen, that vision, as Gareth mentioned, that's the vision and the heart that God has for the church to be, and not to erase, the majority culture in this country, not to do that, not to do the reverse, but actually to work together, and it will be intentionally seeking out resources. So that, for me, was a really beautiful example of here's an issue we need to address in the church with young people, and seeing that done across ethnic and across ethnicities and gender as well. It's really powerful.
Fantastic, thank you. So Jude 3?
Jude 3 Project,
Jude
yeah.
3 Project, yeah.